Climb into the cockpit with pilot and LinkSquare's Chief Legal Officer, Tim Perilla, as he invites legal leaders aboard to share advice that will help you navigate even the most turbulent times of in-house counsel work. We'll cover a range of topics from data privacy to legal team structure to public company transactions and beyond. You don't want to miss this series. Fasten your seatbelt and prepare for takeoff. You're listening to Cockpit Counsel.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Cockpit Counsel. My name's Tim. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at LinkSquares, and with me today on the show, we have Alex Poshma and Deanna Sheridan from 3 Step Sports. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. We're excited to be here.
So we start off every show the same way. It is pilot-themed. I am a pilot, and I like to ask everybody what their pre-flight ritual is.
Ooh, I don't. Do you want to go first or?
Mine is a Bloody Mary.
Okay.
Usually, that's about it. Everything else can just fall into place on its own.
Well, he's a lot younger than me, and I have a child, so I think mine usually doesn't involve the Bloody Mary. But honestly, just sort of like doing that last sort of check of everything that's packed, making sure that I've got everything that I need to, and. Honestly, I try to take a moment after I've gotten through the security gate just to kind of not really truly meditate, but kind of ground myself for a minute before we take off.
Do some easy breathing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Just readjust.
Are you a nervous flyer?
No, actually.
Okay.
But it's just nice to take that moment in the midst of what's otherwise a really crazy schedule usually.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about your career paths. Deanna, let's start with you. What brought you to 3 Step?
I might actually have to back up a little bit before we dig into the 3 Step chapter. So I was at Spartan Race as the general counsel for a number of years, and I started in August of 2016, and it just happened to be about a month before Alex started as a legal intern at Spartan Race. And Alex quickly became part of the legal team at Spartan Race. He was invaluable. And he came back for a second semester. I then became the GC that year. And he was on my team until late 2019. Okay. And then I'll let him talk about where our paths diverged for a little bit. But then in 2021, Spartan Race had really sort of navigated the whole pandemic challenge, and we'd gone through a lot of ups and downs, and I had gotten to the point where I thought it was time for a new challenge. Yeah. And I really wanted to stay in sports, and 3 Step sort of fell into my lap. I was contacted by a recruiter. Nice. And they asked if I wanted to start the legal department at the largest youth sports organization in the entire country, and it just happened to be here in Eastern Massachusetts.
That's awesome.
And so I very quickly threw my hat into the ring, got the gig, and then picked up the phone and called Alex and asked him if he wanted to get the band back together when I got a budget for a number 2 attorney. So
that's awesome.
And then I'll let Alex talk a little bit about where he was in 2019 through 2021.
Yeah, so as Deanna said, I started at Spartan Race as a legal intern. Tried to stay there as long as I could. They had to kick me out the door at times, but that was my way of just trying to make myself invaluable, like Deanna said. And I was fortunate enough for that to become my gateway to becoming an in-house attorney once I graduated. Yeah. Was with Deanna and the small team that we were operating with for about 2 years after graduating from law school, and working in the event industry was exactly where I wanted to be. So it was a perfect fit. Tie in the sports and the media, it was perfect for me. Yeah. Once, the 2019 era started to hit for us, I started thinking about just how can I branch out my career? Mm-hmm. And I actually ended up moving over into the risk management and insurance brokerage space for a company based in Boston called Risk Strategies. All right. And was there for almost 2 years to the day when I actually made the commitment to come over to 3 Step. And joined Deanna back and forth with like the sports and media and everything like that. And it was a new challenge that I was really excited about because I had never built a legal team before, built any of the pillars that, a company requires for that function. So I was ecstatic to join her, and here we are almost like 2 years again. It's like we keep doing these like 2-year cycles when all the exciting stuff happens.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. And then Deanna, did you have law firm experience before going in-house?
I did, yeah. So I was at Hinckley, Allen, and Snyder for a number of years early in my career, doing construction litigation.
Okay.
And in my heart of hearts, I knew I was not a litigator. So I eventually left that practice. And then I was at Ropes & Gray for a number of years in the private equity group there. So cool. I've definitely sort of dabbled a little bit before I went in-house. And then I also had an in-house role from about 2010 to 2015 at a company called Noresco out in Westboro, which does energy services construction. Mm-hmm. So it may seem at first glance that there's not, path tying all those things together, but construction lent itself really well to everything at Spartan Race. So, we were doing these big builds every single week for those events. So it's been a really fascinating path, and I'm really happy that Spartan Race happened because I think, both Alex and I can agree we really just clicked with the sporting events and the media connections and sponsorship and everything that that type of practice requires.
Yeah, absolutely. Working in sports is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah. What I found most interesting about, so I was at DraftKings before this. What I found most interesting about working in sports is I never thought about, even though you hear about it on, every time there's a league strike or something like that, I never really thought too much about how important two things are. Employment, like labor and employment background, and IP. It's something that you just don't really think about. You see your favorite athletes on TV, or go to college games, whatever it may be, and it just never really occurs to a lot of people to think about, those are workers,
right? Exactly.
That's their job.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting though. So.
Yeah, there's it is interesting to look at what our day-to-day life looks like and compare it to probably what each of us respectively thought it was going to look like when we were in law school, because it's very different.
Yes.
And there are even aspects to, tort law that we really have to master in ways that I never would have anticipated when I thought I was just going to be a transactional attorney. So it really is a true generalist position being in-house for a sports company, because you have to know enough of everything in order to triage and then be able to pull in outside counsel if you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things you mentioned in your background, litigation, have you found that, how have you found that to color the way that you approach in-house practice, if at all?
I don't know if it heavily influences it on a day-to-day, especially when we're taking a look at, approaching a new transaction. Sure. It's always the honeymoon period when you're approaching a new partner and you're, negotiating what those deal points might be. It certainly helps in terms of managing litigation as the client. But I feel like it's helpful to sort of know what those cautionary tales were. And I learned so many of them through, assisting clients with their disputes when I was in litigation, that it really helps that aspect of it just in, sort of the back of your mind as you're navigating the day-to-day. But then I think the most important impact is actually how I interact with outside counsel. Because having come from a number of different law firms, there were some others I didn't mention in there that, were shorter stints.
Sure.
I think it really helps both outside counsel having an understanding of what's hitting the in-house folks on a day-to-day basis and the other way around. And so I really think just knowing and appreciating what the outside counsel, is taking on when I have to hand off that work to somebody really helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've found that, so I've been in-house my entire career, but had the, I don't know if I want to call it the pleasure, but I had the opportunity to deal with a bit of litigation throughout my career, and I found that it takes a long time, and there are a lot of opportunities to screw things up and make things go right.
I think the challenge, especially considering both Spartan Race and Three Step and how fast both companies move, the challenge for me is that I've gotten very used to this fast pace over the last, few years. And as soon as you enter litigation mode, it's like everything just slows down to this crawl, and you're sort of at the mercy of the court schedule. So I think that really is a challenge in patience, as well as making sure that you're navigating the conversations with the executive team accordingly, because people are usually sort of demanding results because the business needs to move on. And, it's two very different worlds in a lot of ways.
Exactly. And there's that tension of like, I want this solved today, but I don't want to pay to get it solved today.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Which is pretty tough to thread the needle.
We can easily solve this today.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
That's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about how you approach partnering with the business. That's a recurring theme on the podcast here.
Absolutely.
We talk a ton about being a good business partner, and we also talk a lot about transitioning from law firm to in-house, and what some of the tips, tricks, struggles, etc. might be. So Alex, maybe we start with you. So you came right out of school into an in-house role. What's been the most challenging thing for you there?
I think the most challenging thing has been that I haven't seen many things blow up, and so and blow up in the I don't get to see many things blow up like into the litigation phase that you guys were talking about as frequently, and especially when I had started at Spartan Race, I didn't see a lot of it.
Yeah.
So I had a lot more fear in terms of like every deal I was working on, and acknowledging the fact that I didn't want my deal to be the one that was under a microscope when the litigation actually happened. Yeah. So for me, it was becoming comfortable with that level of risk that, if you're working on 300 deals a month or a year, like you never know. It's just the power by numbers there. And so for me, experience and like seeing enough deals go right really started to give me the confidence that, number one, I knew what I was doing. Number two, I knew I was asking the right questions. And number three, not everything was, this parade of problems or anything like that. Right. So, that was really the biggest struggle, coming right from law school into the in-house realm.
But that also plays into how important it is to have really good communications within your legal team, because there were a lot of conversations that we would have where I was walking you through something that you didn't necessarily have immediate exposure to, but making sure that he knew that, we weren't going to hold him solely accountable if a deal went south.
Just mostly accountable.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
You should still panic.
We'll apportion, the responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think that's really helpful in terms of undertaking everything you learned in law school and making it sort of hypothetical risk.
Totally.
And then going, this is risk that the business is willing to eat. Like, we just need to move forward with this deal. Like, let's go for it. And so that's just part of learning how to be part of an in-house practice, and like sort of fine-tuning your approach in accordance with the the risk appetite that the business has, as well as the priorities of the business.
And I had the benefit of working for a company that was, as Deanna was talking about, like kind of the Wild West. Like, we weren't hyper regulated. We weren't, in any of those areas of the business world that has a lot of attention drawn to it from like the compliance standpoint. Sure. So I got comfortable with risk very early in my career, as opposed to starting at, a large corporation where there was a lot of red tape and policies and procedures.
Yeah.
The risk that I was looking at from the beginning was big risk in terms of like us running these events and the different parts of our obstacles that people would tend to find risky, especially if they were attorneys.
Right.
And so that's helped me when I've transitioned into roles in the more corporate sense in terms of feeling comfortable with the risk. Like, I've seen some really risky contracts, but I also know what one looks like when it doesn't have a lot of risk in it.
Yeah, exactly. And whenever it's good to recognize that risk. And, what I typically tend to do when I see something that maybe there's a point in a contract where we're like, all right, we want the deal. We're going to do the deal. There's this risk. It's more of a emphasis to the people who are managing the relationship to just be like, you need to actively manage this relationship.
Exactly.
And make sure that you like each other. Because as long as you like each other, that risk isn't going to come to fruition.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And or you're at least going to be able to avoid like one day just getting, served with process or something like that. A lot of things, I say it a lot, but a lot of things have to happen for that parade of terribles to even kick off. And then once it does kick off, to get it to that worst case scenario, you usually have to make a lot of pretty bad decisions.
Right. It can go in a lot of different directions, even if you get a breach notice, even if the other side gets the breach notice, whatever it is. So.
There are a ton of ripcords that you can pull along the way, even after it's filed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how you run your team, and maybe I assume that there's a little bit of all hands on deck. Everyone does everything. But Deanna, like, how do you think about growing the team, and like, what are some of the most important things that you do when you come in and just establish a legal function?
Sure. So, I mean, starting at 3-step especially is a really good example, because there was no legal function. It wasn't like I got to inherit structure or process from a predecessor. And so I would say the first 60 days was really just listening to all of, the business partners, all the different department heads. In the 3-step world, that means the sport directors. We have 8 individual sport industries that we operate within.
Okay.
And so the sport directors are really the ones that are helping call the shots on exactly what level of risk we might want to take on in a contract, or what the challenges and the pain points might be from an operational perspective. And then, I really just did a listening tour to make sure that, I wasn't coming in making assumptions about what we needed. I really needed to respond to not just what the business needed us to approach, but prioritize accordingly.
Right.
And Alex started only about 2 months after I did. So I had kind of formed that loose structure of, okay, this is what I think that we need to put in place. And the nice thing about bringing him aboard and having worked together before is that we had all of this pre-existing communication plans and process and structure that we were able to kind of say, does this actually fit in the 3-step world? Do we need to customize it? Is this just not applicable at all? And I think, what is typical for most departments, if you have a brand new in-house attorney or a brand new legal department, is that contracts have to be a massive focus. And so it was really getting our arms around the existing population. Where are they? Do we actually have all of them? Are they well labeled? Kind of figuring out the repository aspect of the existing contracts, and then taking those and starting to determine, can we categorize these in sort of like bigger buckets, so that we can start figuring out what our contract management looks like.
Right.
And so we started looking for a contract management platform, and Alex was really the specialist in terms of guiding our team to development of the individual contract workflows and what each of those needs were within a contract workflow, as well as what the contract templates look like. So even though that was a huge focus for us in 2022, that's clearly 50% of what we need to focus on a regular basis. And so it was getting our arms around what can we sort of kick the can on, even though we know it's a need, and what is an immediate right now need for us. And so there was a lot on the insurance, safety protocols, risk management side of things that we tag teamed on a lot of the day-to-day, but then on, the bigger management issues, that was usually me taking it on, so Alex could focus on the day-to-day operations of the business.
Nice. And so do you feel like your stakeholders are primarily the same, or do you tend to think about it a little bit differently? Like, are you more focused on sort of those individual sports leaders, and you're more focused on the operations side of things, or how do you think about that?
I would say, I spend a lot more of my time interacting with the executive team and, providing guidance or responding to support requests from the executive team and making sure they get everything they need, especially since a lot of those requests are coming from the board. And and so I would say that's a pretty large chunk of my time. And then Alex and I probably have a complicated Venn diagram in terms of like who we interact with on a daily basis. Even though it's a large company now, we've gotten to the point where we have almost 1,200 employees. It still feels very small at HQ. and the sport directors are definitely like in the inner circle of our core clients. And so I would say we overlap in our relationships with the sport directors. And then, sort of the further down you get into the business and within each of the sports, Alex has a lot more interaction with the folks that are, sending the contract requests and have that insurance question or whatever those day-to-day needs are.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alex, how did you go about fostering those relationships when you first started?
Yeah, I mean, luckily Spartan Race prepared me for that.
Sure.
We, working with people who are boots on the ground, they're the people who are, getting it done. They're the ones who don't care about like the paperwork that has to happen in order for it to be, handled the proper way in the company's eyes. They're just like, I need the certificate of insurance. Like, what do I need to do to get this contract signed? They don't even care what's on the contract sometimes. So
sure.
Fostering that relationship in a way where you're breaking down what the risks are in terms of like, this is the reason why we're not signing it right away, or here's something that you need to manage in terms of the relationship that's there, was difficult, and I learned that very well at the Spartan time of my career, because a lot of the people were like construction workers, essentially.
Right.
Or it might be their first job out of college, and they'd had no exposure to, working with in-house legal before.
Yeah, and so you have to be able to translate a lot of what the risk and also what the initiatives are at the higher levels that Deanna is tending to communicate on a lot. So that allowed me to really think about how can I translate this in a way that helps them understand what the risk is, but also helps the business move forward in like the best possible way. And so, yeah, I mean, it was tough, but I think Spartan prepared me for it. So when I got to 3-step, I understood what level of risk these people were used to seeing, and then also what level of risk I needed to, familiarize them with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just the two of you on the legal team.
We're the only two attorneys. We have 2 legal ops folks on our team.
Nice.
And they're imperative to getting everything done that we get done on a regular basis. And they were with our corporate operations team and both sort of raised their hand to come over to legal when we started, which is astonishing because
that's very cool.
Very little exposure to in-house legal at 3-step at the time. And so the fact that they were willing to, it sounded interesting to them and they wanted to dive in was, really reassuring.
Yeah.
And they coincidentally started the same day on the team as Alex. So it was really just sort of instant legal team when we all got together.
That's awesome.
It was very unusual in terms of, the timing of all of us just immediately rolling up our sleeves and diving in.
Obviously very fortunate to have that timing work out.
Yes,
but to be able to pull 2 operations people in.
Massive.
That is incredible.
Yeah, so we were
I wish
able.
I could do that.
I don't know if it'll happen again. I think we got really lucky with that one, but they've been absolutely instrumental in terms of helping us stand up all of these processes, giving us the feedback on what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
And they're also, working hand in hand with everybody across the business to, get those certificates of insurance issued and to, make sure the background check has been sent to that coach. And, so really that boots on the ground sort of level of support, we wouldn't be able to do it without them.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's incredible to have, especially people coming over from other parts of the business because they already have an understanding of how to operate within that
and the relationships
that organization, and they have the relationships.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was easy for us to get buy-in because they were familiar faces too.
Yeah. All right. You both caught lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, we really did. We knew it was probably unlikely that we'll get that again, but we've fully utilized it. I mean, we to sort of come back to your original question. We operate very interdependently. All 4 of us are sort of like running in parallel on a daily basis. And the beauty of a small team is that, especially when you're all in person most of the time, we're really in the office most of the time together, is that there's all these individual checkpoints, during the day that can be very ad hoc that helps move everything along very, very quickly. And so, yes, we have, weekly team meetings and, we'll have one-on-ones in order to make sure that we're digging into the bigger projects. But there are times that Alex and I have no idea what the other person is working on. And, we just have to do that 10-minute sort of, what are your priorities today kind of conversation.
Yeah.
And so
the daily scrum.
Yeah, exactly. And it really and, usually in the hallway when we were passing each other.
Right. But getting coffee together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it really allows us to sort of make sure that we're constantly shifting the legal team's priorities in accordance with the business needs. Because as everybody knows, the number one challenge with one in-house legal is that, you think you have 3 priorities that morning when you come into the office, right, and then boom, they all shift and you have 3 new priorities. So
exactly. That are now way more important than
exactly,
anything else.
Exactly.
Like, forget about that. That's back burner now.
Or maybe I can delegate it and somebody else on the team can take something and maybe not. Maybe it's all hands on deck on the new priority. So just that constant communication has been really imperative.
That's awesome. So how are you thinking about growing the team? Is there a need for it yet?
Oh yeah.
Okay. I mean that's relatively few legal staff for a relatively large organization.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
1,200 people.
We've been working on cloning me for some time, and now that the experiments aren't working, we're coming to reality here.
I think we had 600 employees when we started a year and a half ago. We have 1,200 now.
That's awesome.
We're highly acquisitive, and so that number is definitely going to continue to grow. And almost more importantly for the legal team in terms of taking a look at those ratios for support is the brands. We keep the branding for each sports acquisition that we have so that, the local community, the moms and the dads and, the players are still really recognizing and connecting with that brand or set of brands that we might acquire. It's just sort of exponential requests with each acquisition. And so, as we have each closing, it's not just sort of like, okay, bring them aboard and get them through the orientation and integration checklist. It's okay, now we have to really add them to the pile in terms of, that many more contracts and that many more requests. And so there is a need for more staff. I think we've been able to leverage technology really, really well.
That's great.
In order to make sure that we're not completely drowning. But hopefully we'll add 2 team members by the end of next year. We'll see if we can get more aggressive than that. So
that's awesome. What kind of data do you track?
Well, some of it's more manual than others. We definitely track total volume as well as sort of the trends and the spikes. 3 Steps business is unique because we're very driven by the sports seasons.
Sure.
And so prior to each of the spring and the fall seasons, we normally see like an enormous spike in contract demands as well as the COI requests. And then of course, just all of the ancillary relationships that go along with that, whether it's a sponsorship, deal that we need to rush to put in place prior to like a big launch or something along those lines. And so tracking those and predicting those has been really, really important for us to report up to the executive team so they have awareness of what's hitting and when. But then also we're tracking I guess the bands of what the dollar amount thresholds would be. We haven't really started in on tracking like individual terms on risk assumption. And I think that's the next stage for us is that now that we've got a solid year's worth of contract data under our belt, we can now go back in and take a look at our playbooks and determine, okay, how many of these were outside of what we would normally like to negotiate? And, where can we continue to sort of fine tune what our playbook looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. That's it's great once you hit that critical mass and you can start to make broader portfolio level decisions.
Yeah, those trends are really, really helpful to track.
Yeah, and it helps from a negotiating standpoint to be able to just right out of the gate understand where you can go.
Of course,
right? Where you're not sort of making a decision on every contract in isolation and then sort of hoping that it works out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or going, what was that contract language that we liked in that one deal 3 months ago? It's, it's all in the same system and we can refer back to it.
Yeah.
So, we're lucky to utilize the technology to be able to focus on the contract data, but then we're also tracking incident reporting. And for us, that mostly looks like conduct issues, whether it's player conduct, parent conduct, or coaches or officials. And so it's really important for us to get our arms around if there are trends there, because, if they're all happening with one coach or all happening with one, sports brand, that's very indicative of of a challenge that we need to address more than just on a one-off basis. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's the same challenge that we're having across multiple sports, and we need to start looking at those trends. So that incident reporting has been really helpful, and then obviously claims, just like, any company needs to make sure they're on top of those.
Yeah, absolutely. The contracting side and utilizing technology for that is, I think, pretty obvious. One of the things that I tell people is that, relatively, it's great that you've got 50, kind of like a 50-50, split between contract and non-contract work. But that's like now 50% of your world that, from a technology standpoint, I think there's a little bit of a void. I mean, we're obviously trying to fill it,
right?
Absolutely. With our new product Prioritize, but that's sort of, I think, where the metrics start to get pretty interesting too. Being able to track those types of incidents over time is incredible. I mean, even looking at things like, is it a particular geographic region,
right,
where you have issues, right? One particular sport in a particular geographic region and a different sport in a different geographic region.
Exactly.
Right? Like, are the hockey parents in the Northeast worse than the football parents in Texas?
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Or the officials, or whatever,
Right,
whatever that challenge is.
Yeah.
And, maybe it's not even, sort of an issue that legal would necessarily need to dive in on, but we have tended to become, I think, because of all the relationship building that we focused on in 2022, the problem solvers just generically. And so if somebody's not sure where else to go in the business, a lot of times folks are coming to us and just saying, hey, I have this really problematic conversation that I have to have, with this outside party. Can you give me a few pointers? And, we can't jump on the phone and solve every single issue, but it's really helpful for us to have that visibility so that we are seeing sort of the unofficial trends, or understanding, no, this is the same challenge that actually every single sport, faces, and it's just inherent to the business.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we were going to jump back to it, but I'd love to hear from you, Deanna. Like, what were some of the challenges you had your first in-house gig, like making that transition from a law firm to in-house?
Oh, that's a great question. So my first in-house gig was at a company called Noresco, and at the time it was a very small subsidiary of Carrier Corporation, which was in turn a subsidiary of United Technologies at the time, even though there's been a lot of mergers and separations between the various corporate entities since then. And so I went from only having been in big law practice to suddenly being, in a lot of senses, the best of both worlds for my first in-house gig. We had a small team. There were just a handful of attorneys, and we had a couple of support staff. And the Noresco legal team was really able to have the independence and the authority to roll out a lot of their own contract initiatives on their own. It's energy services construction engineering, so the dollar amounts tend to be quite high compared to what we're dealing with on a regular basis. And so,
it's missing a comma.
Yeah, exactly. And so, there were definitely times where if it was a $30 million contract, I was just spending my time making sure I was collecting 14 signatures on it to make sure it was thoroughly approved and vetted. But it allowed me to sort of synthesize, everything I felt I had learned in both a transactional practice and a litigation practice. Very, very contract heavy, massive contracts that had a long sales cycle. So a lot of just fine tuning of the terms that we needed to negotiate out with the clients. And so I think it was actually a very gentle introduction to in-house because there weren't those sort of rapid fire immediate demands on that business because of the industry that it was in. And then the other benefit of working in a place like Noresco, especially when I started in 2010, was that we had these beautiful corporate policies handed down from United Technologies, and we didn't have to develop them ourselves.
Right.
And so we were responsible for enforcement across the organization, and making
my
sure
hands are tied.
Yeah, exactly. Like, sorry, got to get your ethics training in this quarter. But it was really nice to have all of this incredible expertise sort of at your back.
Yeah.
If I had a software licensing issue and I wasn't quite sure who to go to, I didn't have to pick up the phone and call outside counsel because we had an army of intellectual property attorneys in-house, and I could call one of them, and that was my IP partner. And so it was really fabulous to be able to sort of slowly transition out of that law firm environment where you had this sort of similar structure because it was such a large corporate environment. And I think by the time I left Noresco, we had more than 300 attorneys within all of the United Technologies.
Wow. That's a big organization.
Absolutely. I mean, so very, very different working for a subsidiary of a Fortune 50 company and then going to a place like Spartan Race immediately after. So I think that was probably the bigger culture shock for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alex, I know we were talking a little bit beforehand about, you mentioned, the importance of taking a position. Would love to hear your perspective as an attorney relatively early in your career. What are some of the challenges with taking a position?
Yeah.
And how are you thinking about that?
Exactly. Yeah.
Or not taking a position, because sometimes that's worse.
Yeah, exactly. Finding that right balance of, when the appropriate time is and, looking at the audience of who you're relaying that decision to. I think early in my career, and Deanna can attest to this, it was hard to decide where my legal and business analysis should start and end. So when, I was right out of law school, I had been trained to just develop the legal analysis, put it on paper, and then you have a teacher grading you on it, right?
Yeah.
When you go in-house, your internal clients aren't just looking for the legal analysis. They're looking for a recommendation. They're looking for, your expertise to help them. And when you're working with people who are boots on the ground, like it's, paramount that they're understanding, like, what are the next steps? Am I allowed to build this 15-foot bridge, over water, or am I not allowed to? You know what I mean?
Right.
And, as you're going up the chain in terms of the people that you're working with, whether it's, somebody in middle management or someone at the executive level, understanding like, what is the legal analysis portion and then what is the recommendation, and do you need to put one in there? And so for me in my career, I've started to develop, the sense of when is my recommendation, vital and when is it not? When do we have people who need to just make a decision on this is X amount of dollars if we do it this way, X amount of dollars this way, or is it, if we go path A, there are all these different steps that, legal is going to be involved in and that we're going to have to weigh in on. Yeah. Or, option B, that it's like, this is just part of the business model. We're taking on this risk. We're expecting this type of issue to come up as part of how we run the business. So thinking about the communication of it is really the key for me, and, developing that with the people, who you're working with the most and understanding their styles, their risk tolerance, all those kinds of things. Because like we were talking about before, our brain isn't just valued for the analysis portion of it. It's the, the expertise that we're providing.
Yeah, I think about the real value of in-house attorneys as being experts in the company.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like all of us have a certain level of competency that we're to even be in the seat that you have to possess. Right. Like your legal analysis has to be quality.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You have to have an understanding of a particular area of law, if not many areas of law, right? Just at least enough to be dangerous and enough to know, like,
to be able to triage, to know where the decision tree goes and sends it next.
Exactly. And so if the real value is being an expert in the company, then typically like legal analysis isn't bright line.
Yeah.
Unless it's like, hey, I want to do this illegal thing. Well, don't do that illegal thing, please.
Right.
Everything else is just, shades of gray.
Yeah.
And so the expectation that logically follows is that you actually have to synthesize that expertise in the business with, the expertise in the law.
Yeah.
And come to a position. I remember it was a relatively, it was probably my first couple of months at DraftKings, and I was talking with Jason, Matt, Paul, and Tim on an issue we were working with, and I kind of I was asked to chase down some legal implications of what we were talking about, and it wasn't like telling me about legality of fantasy sports. It was around a deal that we were that we were working on in the summer of 2014, and talking through sort of, well, if we go this direction, we give this, then this is what can kind of happen. And Jason just looks at me and goes, stop. It's like, I want to know what you think. And I'm like, well, I'm telling you. He's like, I don't want to know the legal analysis. I want to know what you think we should do here.
Yeah.
He's like, and I told it took me back a little bit, because it was something that was like very much like not something that normally you would ask of an attorney. Yeah. Right.
It's funny because I think
at least the way I perceived it, something that I would normally ask, like having been through similar transactions in the past, I was never asked that question.
Right.
And the leaders that I was working with at that time, in that prior experience before DraftKings, like already knew what they wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think it's more frequent than not that's the challenge that most people face, especially when they step into the GC role.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest transition that I've had, period, in my career, even though I've had a lot of changes throughout my career, is learning how to communicate differently with the executive team. Because prior to that, you're always reporting to an attorney.
Yeah.
Right.
And so we speak the same language. We go through the same analysis. We want to beat each other up on that analysis and make sure it's sound. And so even more when we're bouncing things off of each other, whether it's contract language or a risk analysis, it's, hey, does this make sense to you? Like, let's go through it. The executive team does not have time for that.
Yeah.
And I had to learn that very quickly at a place like Spartan Race, because Joe DeSena, our CEO, will maybe give you 30 seconds before he's just done and he's walking out the door. And so I had to very quickly pivot to, here's what I think we should do. Do you want to hear more? And 99% of the time, the answer was no.
Right.
And so just taking that, and now it's a very different business and a different executive team that we support. And so sometimes there is a requirement for more discussion around the analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so helpful to know that that's generally what the business is looking for, is what's your guidance here based on this? And we don't want to hear on the one hand and on the other hand. We just need to figure out, does your recommendation align with where the rest of the business team, is going? And if not, why?
Right.
And then, make a decision and go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and you touched on the communication between lawyers versus now communicating with people who are not lawyers.
Yeah.
I will tell you that my communication style with my lawyers here is extremely different than my communication style with just about everybody else that I deal with.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that's challenging particularly for attorneys who are coming from a law firm, right? Where
or straight out of law school.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got this training, that you have learned is the way.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you're looking at somebody who's just sort of blinking at you, and you go into an in-depth legal analysis and you very quickly learn, okay, I have to figure out how to reach my audience in a way that, their eyes aren't going to glaze over. What's the best way for me to do this? And it looks very different if it's for the CFO than it does for an employee on the marketing team who needs like the highest level 101 conversation on trademark enforcement, and break it down in a way that makes sense to them so that you can both just make sure you're aligned and then, go execute on the project.
And helping them understand the short-term and long-term implications of like that decision that they're making right then and there. I mean, especially for us where we're working for this business that doesn't always, communicate well on like where we're going to the entire business. Like there are some parts of the business that understand it very well, especially towards the top. But at the bottom of the business, they don't always know. They're told to just keep doing what you're doing. You do it well. That's why you're here. But, when they think that way, they don't always understand when we're saying, oh, we can't sign that contract right now. And, we can't always give them that visibility because maybe it has something to do with, a confidential nature or transaction.
Yep.
But, having them understand that if we sign this right now, here's what the implication is. But down the road, if we sign this, are we setting a precedent with this partner? Are we setting a precedent with the market if we do this? And for us, that's pretty big because a lot of the partners that we work with at the 3-step level are relatively unsophisticated when you look at it from a business standpoint. Like a lot of them were, spit and handshakes. That's how a lot of these deals were done.
Yeah.
And so when we're approaching these partners now with a legal team who's, analyzing the risk and putting those contracts in place, it's setting a precedent for how the company's going to interact with them and then other partners who are within the space. So that's been a real challenge for me. But as we've developed these relationships with a lot of our business partners, they've started to appreciate that, because then it gives them a leg to stand on if there's ever a conflict.
Well, and especially when they know we're not going to try to over-lawyer it or, be overly risk averse in a business that's actually willing to assume a certain level of risk within a certain contractual framework. And then that's compounded by the fact that we're highly acquisitive and everything is constantly changing. I mean, we are constantly going through integration challenges, and so our processes have to change. And I think the biggest challenge that we face is making sure that we are communicating really, really well to our business teams. We're actually going to pivot. I know you guys have learned this for the last year, but we really need to make an adjustment into this overall process, and now we're changing the signature authority thresholds, or we're going to approach this COI request system very, very differently. And it's to make sure that we're accommodating the needs of the business on the whole. But that doesn't necessarily make sense to somebody who's just trying to get their lacrosse event off the ground, or just trying to get their baseball, club team happening. And it's just okay, now they're changing the processes again. And so it is really difficult to sort of maintain that trust, because you don't want to be constantly sort of shifting the, landscape on people. But you sort of have to in a business that is growing this quickly.
As the business changes, everything has to change with it. And process transformation is always the most difficult, I think, for people to really accept, particularly when it's driven by things that aren't immediately visible to the people who are impacted by it. So I know we've got a handful of questions. Alyssa's been fielding them here. So Alyssa, maybe we'll let you jump in here.
Yes. All right. So the first one is, what is one hot take that you have about working in-house?
I've got my hot take. Do you want me to go first?
You go first.
My hot take is that you actually have to unlearn almost everything you learned in law school. It is, and we've been dancing around this, right? I mean, I think that there are times that the focus on perfect analysis actually gets in the way of us being good business partners.
That's right.
And so I think the times that I've really tripped up, even in the last couple of years, let alone it being a much bigger challenge when you're just starting off in your career, because that's all that you know, is that I have to really take a step back on a lot of analysis and go, okay, what's the most important thing here? Because alignment with the executive team is paramount. Like, you don't have anything else if you don't have that alignment. And so you have to use the same nomenclature, have the conversations in a way that reach your audience, and make sure that you're actually taking your cues from the executive team in a way that you can roll it out to the rest of the business effectively. And I feel like I've learned far more in the last, I'd say 6 or 7 years, just focusing on communication styles, leadership styles, different challenges that, in the old days we used to refer to as soft skills, that are way, way more important. And I think that law school undervalues that for law students. You're trying to cram as much qualitative legal education as you can into 3 years for, law students that are going to law school. And it's tough to try and layer in anything on top of that. Law schools have been doing a great job for the last 15 years of putting those practical workshops in there and, layering other skill building. But it's tough because, it's really just preparing you for the theoretical aspects of being an attorney, being able to flip open, your Westlaw or whatever it is and do your legal analysis. And you really have to learn under fire in constant communication with all of the different business partners in a way to be the best business partner that you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about an important aspect of that is in law school, you're taught that, and it's part of the legal training, you're taught that like every fact matters, because it actually does. Like in real life and in legal life, every fact matters, right? You can go through the exercise of like, oh, I'm going to change the facts a little bit. Now, how does your analysis change? And change the facts a little bit more. Now, how everyone's gone through that, right? In law school and elsewhere, right? As you start to investigate things. But what I think there's an element of unlearning that has to happen. It's like every fact that you hear is important to you,
yes,
but not important to them.
Right.
And so understanding the level of detail that you need to get into to support a position in a way that makes sense is, I think, really, really challenging.
And I think it's challenging because so many lawyers are attracted to the law because of the intellectual rigor and because of the analysis. It's fascinating. I mean, who would want to just endlessly noodle on, this contract language or this risk analysis or whatever it is? And, you can't get caught up on that when you're, sort of like in the thick of all of the challenges of managing the business, which interestingly is probably one of the reasons I still appreciate managing outside counsel on litigation, because litigation is still a little more pure in a lot of ways, where it's like, here's the contract dispute or here's the employment dispute, and you can, assess and, figure out what your strategy is accordingly. But when it comes to 90% of what the business is facing on a regular basis, it's much more of, project management skills and what have you learned about technology and integrating with your other departments and being a good sort of like cross-functional leader with all of your other departments. I think that's the stuff that if you don't quickly figure out how to do that on your own, or if you don't get lucky and have a great mentor, can be really, really tough to navigate.
Absolutely. Alex, your hot take?
Yeah.
Get enough time to think of one?
Yeah, I think mine is not everything that you work on is going to be cool and sexy.
Especially
anybody going into the law with that expectation.
Exactly.
But there's a lot more crying in your cereal than you thought there would be.
And, even more refined to in-house for a sports or events company. I think Deanna and I probably get this a lot, where they see, the cool deals and partnerships posted on LinkedIn or on social media. And I think, a lot of the questions that I get are like, do you work on those deals all day long? And the reality that I faced in both of the roles, at Spartan Race and at 3-Step, was that there's a lot that goes behind the scenes. There's a lot, that goes into how the sausage is made that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily see. And, it's really fun to work on a lot of those cool deals, but sometimes the things that are the most important to the business are not the fun things that you need to do. Right. And, especially when you're on a small team and you have to be a generalist, like no job is too small for you. And so, that's something that I tell a lot of the law students who reach out to me when they're, seeing that I'm working at a sports company and they have all of these, assumptions about all the deals that I work on is, yes, I work for a sports company, but I work for a business, and a business isn't all about like the highlight, deals that are up on the front page. There's a lot of things that go into helping the business become compliant, make more money, operate more efficiently, all those types of things. And, Deanna and I definitely have learned to find like the fun aspects of some of those, down and dirty things. But, I think that there's definitely an assumption that
insurance applications.
Exactly. Woo! I mean, I didn't think I was going to be working on insurance applications when I graduated from law school. So things like that, but there's a lot that you can learn about the business, about the different industries, everything like that through the process.
Well, and I think that that has to tie into somebody's why when they're going into a particular business. Like if you're looking at a business and you're like, I just want to work for a software company. Well, good luck. You're just going to work for a software company. It may not be the one that you're actually aligned with in terms of your value set or what you want. And so I think the good thing for us in examining whether we wanted to start at 3-Step is that we knew enough about this business that we were like, yes, we know how to do this. This hits exactly what we want to do on a regular basis. And the why, at least for me, I'm sure it's similar for Alex, is that we get to deliver all of these incredible, events and club sports to kids all over the country. And so it's really helpful to keep in mind, we might be doing a cool deal with an NBA player or with a former NFL player. And, you can kind of go, oh, I wrote that contract, but you're really living vicariously, through the business person. Whereas, when you know that you're directly supporting the folks that are actually creating and operating and managing the sports, I think that resonates a lot more when you get to see all that cool feedback from the parents that are just like, my kid had the best time at this event, or my kid is so well prepared because of the coaching that we got through, your sport. So all the sort of not so fun stuff in the background, it's worth it because that's what you're ultimately trying to deliver.
Yeah, exactly. I get all the time people reaching out, or even just like in conversations, like, oh yeah, and GC at DraftKings, and they're like, oh my gosh, that must be so cool. I'm like, it is, and it's not.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncool. Yeah,
plenty of things that are insurance applications.
Yes,
oddly enough,
exactly.
we had those at DraftKings.
Yeah,
too.
I know. Isn't
Right.
that weird how every business has those?
Oh, maintaining the minute book.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yes, that's a good one.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's funny.
Those were great answers. Next one is the number one tip you have for how to run an effective legal team.
I've got about 100. Number one, communication. I mean, the only time I ever feel like we're starting to slide, sort of off track is when I'm completely siloed and can't reach out to the team just to connect. And there are times that, it's 3 days have gone by, and then other times it's, maybe just 3 hours. And so I think just making sure that every team figures out what their communication style is, whether that's your platform and you use Slack almost exclusively within the team communications, or whatever works for that team. I think it's really important to stick to it. And, we've tried, because we were sort of an instant legal team, we've tried a couple of different things over the last year and a half, and some things worked and some things didn't. You mentioned project management. We tried a couple of project management tools that really didn't work.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so it's like, I think some of it's trial and error, and then some of it's just sort of attuning yourself to what the communication style is with all the other team members. And that's true for 50 people or 5 people on a team. So I think that's the most important part, because otherwise you can't project manage, you can't effectively roll out everything that the team needs to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my number one. My number two is focusing on understanding and learning the different needs of the business. Because once you have the communication strategy, like the second most important thing is making sure that people are working on the things that matter to the business, and we're not spending all of our time working on the things that matter to us. That allows you to we think matter. Yeah, exactly. And I think once you have solidified that, it's one thing because it helps you build the structure, which was a huge thing for us when we first started as a legal department, but also making it a practice to constantly reset, because the business is growing over time. The things that mattered to the business, 6 months ago and to the legal department will have changed. And making sure that we're constantly, restabilizing and refocusing on what does the business need right now? Right. 6 months ago, they needed every contract to get looked at. Right now, do they? They might not. They might want us focusing on other things. And once we have those resets, it allows us to reshift our priorities, look at different tools that we need to use, look at different communication and project management solutions, all those different types of things. And so that would be my number two.
Nice.
That's great. I will do one more specific one. What metrics do you track to measure your productivity and effectiveness on your team?
Whether we're still standing at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Pulse check.
Pulse check.
Yeah. We know we're productive right now because we're just so in it, and we're constantly just adjusting the dials and knobs to make sure that we're focused on the needs of the business. But I know that that's going to change as the team grows. So I don't know if we have any sort of metric that we use right now, other than some of the, actual data tracking that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
In terms of productivity, I think it's qualitative, and just making sure that we're checking in with each other and, hey, did you move, this project forward on this initiative? Because as we all know, it's really hard sometimes to focus on that software integration with finance when you're up to your eyeballs in contracts that day. And so making sure that some of those longer term projects don't get neglected for the short term.
It's like spinning plates.
Yeah, exactly. Like just making sure that they don't slow down too much.
Yeah.
And so I think that's my best, sort of guess at what the metric would be that we would track.
Mine would be, and because I'm much more in the weeds and, with our legal ops team and the contract management systems, is, how many contracts came in this week? How many contracts did we get out? How many are for review? Those kinds of things help me understand how much we actually got done as as a team. Yeah. And that's just because that's where my priority is right now. And that's what, from time to time the business will ask us about, because everything is how can the legal department get things done faster? And when I have a number and I'm like, we got 100 contracts signed this week, it gives us some ammo to show that, we're not just sitting here twiddling our thumbs. Like, we're getting serious numbers done for you guys.
Yep.
And it took us a while to capture that data because we didn't even have a full cycle for a while. And now that we have it and we understand how to look at the knobs, how to, tweak the numbers that are coming in, use charts, all these different tools that a lot of these platforms have made available. It allows us to, number one, like Deanna said, feel confident that like the quality that we're providing is good. But then also like we are, actually being effective in terms of like what's coming in from a contract perspective and then what's going out each week.
I want to add to that because as the team manager, it's also imperative that we have those numbers to refer to so that we're just managing our own expectations, because I know typically lawyers tend to be pretty hard on ourselves and we're always looking for the negative and just going, oh, I didn't get that priority out the door. And so it's really easy to focus on the folks that are screaming, I don't have my contract yet, or whatever the challenge was that you haven't solved for that week.
And of course, the one thing that fell through the cracks is
Correct.
the one thing that your CEO is asking you about.
Yes,
like,
inevitably.
I did a million things this week.
And so actually using that sort of as like, a stabilizing metric for each individual team member is incredibly helpful, because it can be really easy, especially when you're constantly talking to all of the other business units, to hear oh my gosh, legal's underwater, and like it's the black box of legal, we're never going to get our contract out, when does it get finalized? And for us to go, actually we're not failing, we got 100 contracts signed this week and we were able to hit A, B, and C in these other matters, I think is incredibly reassuring. And we talk a lot about tracking an individual win book for each team member, so that not only are you sort of giving yourself that reassurance, like, I actually did pretty great this week, but you can look back on it at the end of the year and look at, what each individual member contributed as well as what the whole team accomplished.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think what's been really fun for me is seeing how our legal ops team enjoys seeing the numbers now.
Oh, yeah.
Like you can tell when it's been a rough week and we've gotten a lot of contracts in, but you can also tell when it's been a really good week, because they won't stop talking about like how good the numbers look in the system, how many contracts we got done, the smile on their face when they get to run the report and say like, hey, Deanna, this week we got 150 out. Like last week it was 75. And it allows you to pressure check and realize, like Deanna said, that like, despite how many things came in, how many things blew up, like, we're still operating as an effective team. Like without the data, we wouldn't have that reassurance.
Right.
Yeah. One of my favorites is looking at the breakage, meaning like how many different deals did we work on versus ones that were closed, and then correcting that for like, okay, deals that closed in the next period, right? But like, I look at every single time the legal team touches a contract as a capital investment in that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so I provide that information to the exec team, particularly to the revenue leadership, to be like, listen, like, it's not just your sales team. Like, the legal team didn't just appear so that the legal team could do legal team
create
things.
Our own work.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Like, this is, we had 40% of the deals that we worked on that didn't close, or we had 20% or 50, or whatever it may be. Like, that's something that revenue leadership should then be looking at and be like, okay, are we getting to contract too fast?
Right. Yeah. Like what's
are we using our resources appropriately is the best way to put that.
Yeah.
Right. Like, okay, don't just shove NDAs to every single person you talk to, or terms of service to every single person you talk to, which, may be a little bit difficult to tell your sales team.
Yeah.
Right.
But like,
I think similarly for us, having had so many different sports brands that may have been under one umbrella before there was a legal team, but no centralization or standardization on what those terms look like. It's really impossible for the business to tell sort of like what's going well in addition to what's going wrong.
Right.
And so, I think it's allowed us, like, so for example, we not only track our contracts by sport, but we track them by the individual brands that are getting requested.
Right.
So we can go back in and not just look at trends, but go, okay, what's the ROI on the way that they're actually operating their business events? Because it could be just for geographic reasons, just because of the subculture of the brand, it could be completely different than a similar sport brand that just happens to be 200 miles away. And so for us to take a look at those and go, you know, hey, this might be pretty interesting for you to take a look at and hand that off to, you know, the sport director, I think is invaluable data that nobody realized you could really utilize the contracts in that way. It was just transactional and a means of, you know, getting the work done and getting the event launched. Whereas now we can actually go, no, we actually need to tweak some things. We're paying way too much in our down payments for facility rentals, or way too much up front, or whatever it is, and start tracking those trends and be able to give really good feedback to the business.
And for us, because we're essentially like this conglomerate of all these different little businesses who strike their own deals, it allows us to see, you know, where the frequency is and where, you know, they're overlapping with the same partners. And so it's allowed me to provide some business impact where I see that 6 different sport operators are using the same facility and they all have different rates. And so I'm able to say, hold off, we're not signing any of these until we get our preferred rate. And everyone at 3-Step is getting that. And so, you know, that's one impact there. Or on the sponsorship front, seeing that 30 different, you know, brand operators are using the same sponsor as a 10x10, you know, exhibitor. That's a perfect opportunity for a sponsorship team to look at that data and say, hey, does it make sense to just get them as a national sponsor and collectively put one contract in place so legal isn't generating 30 of these, and then we're also leveraging it to give them, you know, better benefits, you know, have one contract in place for multiple years, all those kinds of things.
Volume favor.
So the business is like really actually starting to become interested in the data to the point where they're like asking us, how can I run these reports on my own? Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, Deanna, Alex, thanks so much for joining.
Thank
you. It's been an awesome conversation.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
And yeah, we got to do this again.
Agreed.
It'll be fun. We'll pick like 1 or 2 topics and really go deep on them.
Okay, that sounds great.
Let's figure that out. So
would love to.
Awesome, Alyssa. Thank you as always. And if you like this, give us a follow, give us a like on all the socials, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.